Hi, welcome to today's seminar. The specific topic is preparing students for harmonic work and voice leading on the AP theory exam. I've taken a few students through this, and I have some approaches that make it much more efficient for the students to learn and work through in a timed situation. So to begin with, I'm focusing on the free response questions that have to do with harmony. So specifically the four-part writing of a given progression, and which branches into things like melody harmonization and also harmonic dictation, where they're hearing this orally and notating down the upper line, the soprano, the bass line, and the chords. So let's look at an example straight from the test here. So here's a pretty typical example of a part writing question that would have to work through. Free response question. This is from the Barron test prep book. And so you can see here we've got a progression in A flat major. They are given the starting pitches, which is really nice, and they get some Roman numerals with inversion figures. So there are a number of strategies that are recommended from the AP exam itself, which are very useful, and I'll start with those. So the first thing is for the student to get used to jotting down all of the information that's given in the question. So here we've got our key and our key signature, which is great, and our starting pitches, which we'll worry about in a second. So actually the first step that the book recommends is taking the Roman numeral and the key and listing the chord tones just in a stack, so you know what your possible notes are that you're distributing amongst all the voices. So obviously our one chord would be, something like this: A flat, C, and E flat. Our 7 diminished chord would be G, D flat, and B flat there. And notice I'm not really thinking about the inversion at this point. I'm really just focusing on getting our note ingredients out of the Roman numeral. So just thinking about the root, the third, and the fifth, not really thinking about the inversion that we have to have at this point. Our 1/6 chord is going to be the same contents as our 1 chord over there. And I'm going to skip over the secondary dominant here and just go to the end. The 5/7 chord should be an E flat dominant 7. So E flat, G, B flat, and D flat. And then our 1 chord at the end, of course, is the same. And the AP exam works with the cadential 6/4, as they label that as a 1/6/4, which there are pros and cons. So I'll deal with that later. And last, so let's construct, now that we have our 5 chord ingredients, right? Our 5 chord has a root on E flat, scale step 5. So let's reverse engineer our secondary dominant, our sort of artificial dominant here. So if we go from E flat and think about what the dominant of E flat would be, that would be a B flat 7 chord. So we've got B flat, D natural, and I'm going to go ahead and put D natural since we're going to have to alter that from the key signature. F, and A flat. So this is the first recommended step that's usually given in test prep books and in the AP sort of official guidelines. The other component of the solution that's recommended, that I think is a great place to start, is that we're going to get our baseline down. So now that we've gotten our notes in each chord, let's build our baseline, because we can tell from the chord and the inversion figure what exact notes our baseline should be. So our 7 diminished chord is in first inversion, 7 diminished 6, which means our B flat is going to be in the bass. With our 1/6 chord, that means it's in first inversion, so the third will be in the bass, C. For our secondary dominant of 5, it's a 5/6/5 chord, meaning again, the third of this seventh chord is in the bass. So that's our chromatic D natural. Get our natural symbol in there. And of course, headed to our cadential 6/4 complex, with which we have a repeated E flat in the bass. I'm just going to go ahead and keep that in the same register. And then going down to 1 at the very end. And that gives us our bass line. Let's go ahead and hear that. Okay, great. So these are two first steps that I think are great in terms of working through these free response questions. It's at this point, I think, where four-part writing usually becomes a very complicated process in terms of working through in a timed test situation. So at this point, the books would say, well, consult your part writing rules, of which there are very many, and avoiding things like parallel fifths or direct fifths or something bizarre. Just part write your way through this. And I think it's at that point where we can definitely prepare students better to approach this more efficiently. So that's where I'm going to pick up today. So once students have done this step, I think it's much more useful for them to draw on an existing library and know how to break this progression into a number of parts. So in general, what I would prepare them for is thinking instead of going chord by chord and having to check your voice leading every single time, I would like students to kind of scan this and they can see recognizable chunks. So the first thing I would definitely want them to recognize is this measure right here is a cadence complex, right? And so I'm not going to go into cadences fully today, but the way that I usually teach cadences is not just the essential 2 chords in the cadence, which is very important, right? So here we have a 5/7 going to 1. So this is an authentic cadence. But you also typically have an accessory chord at the very beginning. So kind of a setup beat. This makes the cadence take more time, makes it seem a little more important and complex. So you usually have a little helper chord here at the beginning of the cadence before you get your setup chord and your final chord. So this could be a cadential 6/4, right? In this case, the cadential 6/4 is almost adding a prep beat to the 5 chord where we're decorating the 5 chord itself. In other circumstances, this would be a predominant. So we'd have a 4 or a 2 in there. So we'd have a D flat or a B flat, and that would be our predominant setup chord. We can learn the formulas for each one of those. So the student would hopefully notice, right, these 3 notes are part of a cadence complex. And another big component of this is I'd ask them to look at the opening, and hopefully they would see that this is where I would want them to recognize that we have an opening. Oh goodness. Hold on. Get this a little better. That we have an opening 1, 2, 3 in the bass. And this is very typical in real music, but also if we're being very specific in sort of test situations, this is a very common opening in harmonic dictation and sort of any sort of part writing free response. So here, I'm going to focus on these openings because they're so common, and I would want students to take care of this first. So this and the cadence. This is what we call a 1, 1, 2, 3, or do re mi in the bass, where you typically have a 1 chord, moving to a 1/6 through some sort of passing chord over the B flat. Now, there are three options that the students can draw on. And I'm going to go to a whiteboard here so we can explain. So I'm going to work in scale steps. So if our bass is going 1, 2, 3, the most straightforward thing that you're going to see, and this is already in the example, we're going to go move from 1 to 1/6, not 3, 1/6 through a passing tone. And this can be harmonized in a number of different ways. So we could have either, as we see here, 7 diminished 6 is one option. Another popular one, that happens somewhat in the actual repertoire and even more often on test situations, is the passing 6/4. And I'll go ahead and put the 5 in parentheses. So the passing 6/4, which is 5 here. And then also our final option is, often we see the 5/4/3 as well. So the reason I'm focusing on this particular part writing chunk is, number one, it occurs very frequently, and this is going to exhibit the way that I'd like students to work their way through a free part writing example. Secondly, though, since this occurs so much in standard progressions, students are also going to have to hear this a lot in a harmonic dictation. And although the choice of that middle chord is not quite a make or break choice, it is good for students to get practice hearing the difference between those. The more they practice those, the more they're going to hear the difference. So the way that I like to have students learn this passing motion is through playing. So not really working through part writing as if we're having to reinvent the wheel each time from the Roman numerals, but as a complex that you are playing at the piano. So all three of these chords, there are some unusual ways of part writing these, and there are some options. I like to teach some default options, so the safe go-to options so students can automatically get those down first. Now, an element that is common to each of these is, and I'm going to go ahead and put this as the upper part, although the way I'm doing this, all three upper parts can be shuffled around however you would like. So the upper line that can stay consistent is what I'm going to call our do, ti, do voice. And so I'm going to switch to just C major to illustrate this. So there's our bass line. So that's a common ingredient in all three avenues, right? So whether we're going through a passing 6/4, 7 diminished 6, or a 5/4/3, that's the common ingredient. So we're going to call that the do, ti, do voice, and I'm going to go ahead and connect these together. And I'm going to connect the bass too. There we go. Now, so let's start with the option that was given in the particular example we started with, which is the 7 diminished 6 as passing. So 7 diminished 6 are other components. I'm going to go ahead and put these in a different color. This is also going to include what I'd like to call the voice exchange voice, meaning that you're doing the exact opposite of what the bass is doing. So you're starting on 3 and stepping down to 1. So we've got our voice exchange voice that's kind of going in opposite from the bass. And when you combine that with the do, ti, do voice, right? You see that sounds very nice. Now, the other missing ingredient here for the 7 diminished 6 is going to be dealing with the part of the chord that we don't have so far, which is the 5th. So scale step 5. And in our 7 diminished 6 chord, this is going to be a walk down voice. So 5, 4, 3. So this one does not have a catchy name, but this is the 7 diminished 6 unique voice here. And we can combine that with the voice exchange voice. And then we'll put in our top voice. And so you can see that these can easily be played at the piano. And I actually recommend that students just memorize each of these options in a nice keyboard style position. That translates pretty cleanly into a 4-part choral spacing. There's really no difference at this point. So that was our 7 diminished 6 option. Now the next one down on the list is the passing 6/4. And the only difference is the passing 6/4 has what I would call the boring voice. So instead of 5, 4, 3, instead of adding that sort of that spice to the progression, we're just going to hang out on 5, 5, 5. And we can hear when we play this in 1 minute, right? So this is actually the hallmark of the passing 6/4, is the boring voice. Makes it sound a little bit plainer. And since this middle chord is just kind of a clean triad, even though it's in second inversion, sounds a little bit plainer, a little bit neater. Doesn't have the dissonance of the 7 diminished 6. So that sounds a little cleaner. And the very last option, the 5, 4, 3, the option that usually isn't there is also the voice exchange voice. We don't have enough voices, so if we're only using 4 voices, we can't have 2 of them on scale step 2. We can't have 2 of them on the 5th of the chord. We need the root and we need the 7th in addition to the leading tone. So again, this is not something you don't have to present students with all the voice leading and the counterpoint and part writing reasons that these things are. Just present them as these 3 options for openings at first, and we can, they can get into the counterpoint later on after they already have memorized it. So the 7 diminished, the 5, 4, 3, the 5, 4, 3 is going to retain. It's usually going to have the do, ti, do voice. All 3 of these have the do, ti, do voice. But we're not going to have the voice exchange voice, and we're not going to have the boring voice. This is going to have usually the 5, 4, 3 voice that we saw in the 7 diminished 6. And we could also have the 3. And the other thing it has from the passing 6/4 is we have the boring voice as well, 5, 5, 5. And now typically the this 5, 4, 3 voice, we kind of have a scale step 3 here going into that channel. So what's interesting is what the 5-4-3 pattern is missing is that voice exchange. That's not there. And it's also combining the defining parts of the 7 diminished 6 and the passing 6-4. So yeah, I mean, you can see how all these options are there. So just to review, if the student were learning this, let me go ahead and list it out, the distinctive voices. So for the 7 diminished 6, the distinctive voices are the sol, fa, mi, and the voice exchange voice. For the passing 6-4, the defining features are the boring voice and the voice exchange voice. And for the 5-4-3, as we've said, so this has the boring voice, the X-4-3 voice, and no voice exchange. So students can kind of remember these as complexes. This is just one example, but it's an important one that shows up in almost every part writing or harmonic dictation on the test. So here, notice we didn't really discuss anything about parallel fifths or voice leading or range or doubling certain parts of the chord or anything like that. I like to start students by literally just memorizing notated piano examples of these 3 passing chords in context. So that when they see, I'm going to go ahead and pop back to our test, right? When they see this on the test, they think, oh, once they list out their chord parts, or even before, they say, oh, well, this is going to be a passing pattern to 1-6. We've got the 7 diminished 6, so I'm looking for my do ti do voice, which will be right here because this started on A flat. And our 5-4-3 voice, so we're started on 5 here, 5-4-3. And then our tenor, who we have starting on 3, this is the voice exchange voice, so 3-2-1. Right, so notice, I think when they go to the memorized pattern, that's much more efficient on a test than trying to work through part writing rules. So one particular thing is they'd probably be very alarmed about the look of these 2 voices here in the top, which is, you know, not the most not the most elegant voicing that this might come in, but this is not incorrect at all. There's nothing wrong with a perfect fifth moving to a diminished fifth that then resolves to a third, right? So that voice leading, that memorized pattern with the 7 diminished 6 lets them do that really quickly and efficiently. And of course, so for playing, you know, for things that aren't the AP exam, this is also something that applies to piano playing in general. That's another situation in which time is an element. You don't have time to think through voice leading rules if you're improvising and playing something. This is a stock opening pattern that your fingers would just know. That's the way, you know, Mozart learned it. That's the way Beethoven learned it. They're not sitting there thinking about whether they're writing parallel fifths as they're improvising. They're falling back on stock patterns that they memorized. So students need to bring this to the exam, and that helps them learn much more efficiently. There are a couple, you know, more patterns that we could go through, like I mentioned, like cadence complexes and some different openings and middles. But this is the general approach, so I would welcome any questions about that. And, you know, thanks y'all for watching. And I will continue more items in this series that are in this vein, connecting fundamentals and more advanced theory work to actual playing situations or, time efficient situations. Thanks everyone for watching today. I'll see you next time.